Hi friends, this is Mindy Eggen and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm digging into some old favorite techniques and giving them a fresh spin to create a vintage look. We'll be using ripped edges, ink blending, and direct to paper to bring in lots of texture and character for today's project. I will have all of my supplies linked down below in the video description and over on my blog. I'm going to be using the Craft Your Life Project Kit Floral Odyssey. It starts with a large stamp set with the floral images and sentiments, coordinating die for those florals and sentiments. There is a die set that cuts out the center for the florals, but also has the separate die set of a compass, which I will be using today in my project. And then there is the stencil. There is part of the stencil belongs to the flowers, and then the other part of the stencil belongs to creating this landscape scene and a coordinating embossing folder. The packaging, of course, gives you the idea and instructions to follow on how to use the stencil. The stencils I'll be using is 3, 4, and 5, which may not look like much at first, but once you layer these together, create this great aerial view like if you were flying in a plane. But I'm going to put a different twist on this. I have my 9 by 12 sticky mat laid out on my work surface, and I placed down a piece of Misty Moor cardstock that measures 6 by 6. I'm going to take the first layer of this stencil, which is actually stencil 3. I'm placing it over the top of my cardstock and holding that down with the satin masking tape since I did cut my cardstock to be the same size as the stencil. Now, part of the adjusting that I want to do to this is I don't want the houses to be in there. So I did look at the guide. I also kind of did a rough draft of it on its own, just to kind of see where the houses were going to lay out and what part of the stencil the houses belong to. And then I masked those areas off with some post-it tape. The first ink I'm going to come in with is Misty Moor. So it's going to be a very tone on tone look. I'm using a large blending brush to cover all of those areas. Now, once I have that first layer laid down, I'm going to lift up the stencil. So, again, it doesn't look like much at first, but once we put all of these together, it's going to look amazing. Now, we have our next layer of the stencil. I'm always making sure that they are right side up in the same direction so that they layer together nicely. I'm placing that over the cardstock, again, holding that down with the satin masking tape. Now, once again, I'm going to bring in some post-it tape and I'm going to really cover up those areas. You're going to start seeing where this is where the houses would start to come together. And I want to cover those up. What I'm really envisioning for this is a treasure map. And maybe that's something you wouldn't have seen at first, but just the way that you were looking down over the top of the landscape really kind of screamed treasure map to me. And I didn't want the houses to be there. I just really loved the landscape of it. Now, for this layer, I'm going to use a mini blending brush, and this is Marshland ink. It helped to change it to a mini blending brush because some of these areas start to get really small, and I really want the brush to get into those detailed areas. It's a little hard to do with a larger blending brush. Now, the last layer of the stencil for this particular scene does have some etchings on here that separate out the houses. So it'll have like H1, H2, and H3. It'll have a letter and a number corresponding to that particular house. So you would need to shift your stencil if you wanted to put the houses in there. But again, I'm leaving those off. So I am going to use that post-it tape or any other type of low tack tape to just mask off all of those areas for the houses, and that's going to leave me with just the detail for the trees and the road. I'm going to be starting off the ink blending for the roads using the Marshland ink, which is the ink that I left off with on the previous stencil. So I'm going to use that to fill in the road. And as I get down, I'm going to actually kind of scatter it. I'm going to make my ink blending very uneven because with that vintage treasure map, things to kind of get faded over time. So I didn't want it to be ink blended perfectly. And I really wanted the tone on tone. I did bring in a little bit of sea forest and just vaguely or kind of briefly brushed over it. So now we have this great aerial view of a landscape that we're going to turn into a treasure map. So I'm going to trim this down and I'm going to be about 5 3/4 by 4.5. So I wanted it to be just a little bit bigger than an A2 size panel. And the reason for that is because I'm going to start tearing the edges. Now, this is a technique that I had learned just years ago to add distressing to my card projects. And I thought it would be really fun to do that for this particular project. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to tear all of those. And I do end up tearing a little bit more down later on because I'm, even though it's a vintage map, I did want to try and have my margins be fairly even. So this white panel I have is A2, so it's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I just kind of slowly went through and tore some of the edges off to try and make those margins a little more even. I'm going to be using the Compass die set out of that Floral Odyssey die set. This is going to look great on top of that map that I created. So I did a bunch of die cutting off the screen, and there are a few different options that you have when you are creating the compass. So if you look on the packaging, it gives you some ideas, but the website also gives you great ideas and stepped out ways that you can do your compass. So I did die cut that first base piece with the ridges from a cream cardstock or an ivory cardstock that I have in my stash. The second piece is Misty Morning. That is the lightest blue. The kind of rim or that outer circle edge that I have is out of Nimbus. I also have that spiral piece off on the right that is from Misty Morning. And then I just kind of went through and mixed in Cloudy Sky and also I think it was Dark Night. Now I can start layering my pieces together. And when I did this, my original one, I kind of played with different color combinations. For instance, this outer ring, if I wanted that a dark color or a light color, it's really up to you if you have some brushed cardstock, brushed foiled cardstock in your stash. That would be really fun to add to some of these elements. There are decorative elements that you can add, like I'm doing here. I'm just doing some liquid glue with the help of my reverse tweezers to add some of those embellishments to it or decorative pieces to it. We are also going to have a topper, which sort of reminds me of a stopwatch, but I thought it just really built up the character for this. I also had experimented with a compass that was in the similar colors to my treasure map, but I did kind of find that they all blended together too well. The colors of the cardstock matched my ink blending a little too well, and I felt that my compass got a little lost, which is why I switched to this blue. It's kind of a, I don't know if I want to say vintagey blue, but a very dusty blue. For the center of the compass, there are a few different options that you can go with. I am going with this layered star. The bottom piece is out of Dark Night. The top piece is out of Morning Frost. And then I added a little bit of foam tape behind there to kind of just lift it up a little bit. And then I have my finishing centerpiece, but you could also add a brad in there so that it spins, which would be a really fun interactive element. Now I have a sentiment that I picked off of the Floral Odyssey stamp set. I have a strip of white cardstock that I placed down into my stamp wheel. I picked up the sentiment with my top plate, and then I'm going to ink this up with the Obsidian ink. When I flip the plate over and stamp it down, I do want to apply gentle pressure because these are kind of delicate and small letters. And if I push too hard, then I would risk it distorting them. So I do press gently, and then I can line up the coordinating die, hold it down with the satin masking tape, and die cut that out. I also die cut out two plain pieces of cardstock using that coordinating die, and I layered them together for some stacked dimension. Now, as I was getting ready to put my card together, I decided I wanted to add a little bit more distressing. So I reached back into some of those fun favorite techniques and I started with ink blending the edges. So that's going to help kind of color up those rough edges that I created. I started with marshland and then added just a little bit of sea forest to the very edge. Now, another technique that I have not done in a long time is taking my ink pad directly to the cardstock and just brushing it across those edges to give it even more of a distressed look. All of those techniques together really pull in that vintage treasure map vibe. Then I'm going to add some foam tape behind my treasure map, and I'm going to add this to a piece of Misty Moor cardstock. So this is actually the same color cardstock that I started with, but it's actually kind of hard to tell because I did so much ink blending and distressing to it. I was originally going to put the compass down in the left hand corners. That's kind of my go to place for elements. But once I looked at my landscape, my treasure map, there was way more detail in the background on the left hand side than on the right. So that is why I shifted my compass to the right, popped up with foam tape, and then added my sentiment up in that top left hand corner. And that's it for today's project. I love how these classic techniques, ripped edges, ink blending, and direct to paper come together to create such a beautiful vintage look with a fresh twist. I hope this inspires you to dig into some of your favorite basics and see them in a whole new way. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed seeing how classic techniques can be used in fresh, creative ways. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a project. Here is another video I think you might enjoy.